Why don't we start out with the wilderness? We will get to the water soon enough, but for now, let's think about the wilderness. Maybe you're tired of hearing about the wilderness already. We are, after all, in uncharted territory at the moment. And yet the church teaches that we can find meaning in uncertain times if we treat this season as a learning time. Since the earliest days of the church, people have sought ways to ground their lives in Jesus Christ. We all have to be grounded in something, right? If not, we're just sort of flying around without any solid ground on which to rest. To be Christian is to be grounded in Jesus Christ. That means knowing who Jesus is and knowing what Jesus' life is all about. And as we do so, as we seek that grounding, we need to be honest with ourselves and with God about our lives. Where we have failed, we acknowledge it. Where we have hurt others, we make note of it. And where we ourselves have been hurt, we name it. In other words, we are honest about life, or at least we try to be. In the church, we use the analogy of the wilderness to describe this Lenten journey. Maybe that resonates with you, maybe it doesn't. I think we have in our culture come to romanticize the concept of the wilderness just a little bit. It's not as frightening to think about the wilderness when we come at it from the vantage point of North Face tents, Marmot sleeping bags, Merrill boots, life is good water bottles, all carted out into the wilderness in the Subaru, if we are to believe the commercials on television. But when the church talks about wilderness, I'm not sure we know what that means anymore. But we're getting a quick reminder, because the wilderness means, at its most basic level, the scary place. And I think we do understand what that means. To be sure, some of us understand it at a deeper level than others. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that just yet, but here's my point. We talk about the wilderness because we need to ground ourselves in Jesus Christ and his experience. And Jesus went out into the wilderness and faced down fear head on. What are we afraid of? For each of us, there are particularities of fear. But I suspect at our deepest level, at a theological level, we are afraid of brokenness. We fear that our lives can be broken. We fear perhaps that our psyches can be broken. Even our memories can be broken. And perhaps we fear that our childhoods can be broken. It can be perfectly natural to want to avoid the wilderness because of all of the things the wilderness may dredge up for us. Living with brokenness is a difficult thing. We develop coping mechanisms. Some of them are healthy, many are not. And sometimes we just want to shove all that as far away from us as we can possibly get it in order not to have to deal with it. There are two stories from the Bible that we walk alongside each other this time of year. We discussed one of them a couple of weeks ago, and that is the story of Jesus out in the wilderness. He is fresh from his baptism, and it is a terrible test to see whether the identity that God has given Jesus in his baptism, this claiming of God that is marked with the water and the Spirit and the dove from the open heavens, will stick or not. That's one of the stories we walk alongside this time of year. Jesus goes out and faces his fears and faces the temptation to let the brokenness of the world beat him down. There's a second story that we tend to think about this time of year as well, and it comes to us from the book of Exodus. We read just a little portion of it this morning when we read about the Israelites grumbling and wanting some assurances. Let me give you a snapshot of the larger picture, though. It's all part of a long story that begins with the creation. You know the story. God created the world, you remember that, and then God created all of the plants and the animals, you remember that, and then finally God created people to be in this world and to take care of it all, you remember that. And then, of course, it all went south in a hurry when the two people wanted not to need God, but rather to be like God themselves. It got worse and worse and worse until finally God despaired and cleaned the whole mess up with a great flood. Then God resolved never to do that again. And so God created a particular group of people to be called out to show the world who God is by the manner of their lives, so that we wouldn't go wrong like that again. God picked one particular family, Abraham and Sarah, to start this whole thing off. It's rocky, to say the least, but God keeps at it, and the people keep working at it. And for a while it goes according to plan. But then, generations later, a huge famine sends God's people off to live in a foreign land, and they're away from that land that had grounded and rooted them in the promises of God. It starts off well enough, but again, things get worse and worse and worse. And soon God's people find themselves enslaved. They have become, for the Egyptians, cheap labor, dispensable almost. They're the migrant workers of the ancient Near East. They are pushed to the margins. They are abused, ignored, objectified, and taken for granted. If there is only one lesson for us to learn from the whole of the Bible, it could be this: that God is always on the side of those who are hurting. So God hears the cries of the people of Israel and sends Moses to lead them away from this place of pain and toil, to lead them into a new land, a promised land of freedom and abundance. And that, friends, is a few thousand years of biblical history in 5 minutes. The point is, though, to get from the bad place to the good place, to the promised land, they have to cross through the wilderness. They have to go through what can be a very scary place. And the promise is that God will be with them. That's always the promise. But it's hard to remember sometimes, isn't it? Of course it is. It's no different for us now than it was then. The people wandering in the wilderness wanted to know that God was with them, to see it and to feel it. And so they started grumbling. There are so many reasons why this basic promise can be hard to remember. There are so many reasons why we might forget that God is always with us. And what those reasons all have in common is this: they come from a place of brokenness. You know that's what sin is, don't you? We mistake sin for all the bad things we've done, and that's a piece of it, to be sure. We can get so glib about understanding brokenness and its effects on us that we don't understand that when we do the things that harm others, there's a ripple effect that goes out and out and out, and that the things we do affect others, and the things others do affect us. I mean, I know we all understand the butterfly effect and know that bad things that have happened to us can harden us and calcify us and sometimes pervert our sense of well-being so badly that we in turn act badly ourselves. That's systemic sin. I know we get all of that. That's why we confess our sins so often. Weekly, actually. It's not because God has to hear us list them off in order to forgive them. Trust me when I tell you, God knows them all already. I do realize when I say that, it makes it very easy to conceive of God as sort of a cosmic version of Santa Claus. You know, he knows with whom you're sleeping. He knows if you're awake. He knows if you've been good or bad. So be good for goodness sake. Friends, that trivializes God. The creator of the universe, who made everything that is out of nothing, has better things to do than to make a list and to check it twice. No, we confess our sins so that we can name the brokenness, not in order to coerce forgiveness out of God. God has already forgiven us. Do you know what sin is? It's all the manure in your life. That's what sin is. That's not the first word that came to mind, but my job is to teach, not to shock. Sometimes, though, we do have to name it. We can be polite and euphemize it and titter about it and come up with a theological word like sin or a sociological word like brokenness to describe it. But friends, it is what it is. Sin is all the hurt, the pain, the brokenness that comes into our lives. We confess it because it gets the better of us. Sometimes we confess it so that we can name it. We confess it because we have to bring our whole selves to God in order that we can find some wholeness for ourselves. Yes, those Israelites needed to find some water in the wilderness. I mean, how long can you wander around in the muck before you need some reassurance? Moses wails out to God that the people are about to stone him, and so God sends him and the elders over to strike a rock, and they get all the water they need out of it. And that's exactly what happens. Moses hits the rock, and the water gushes forth like a stream of life. Paul puts it a little differently when he writes in Romans. He says, "While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." He wants the Romans to understand the same thing that the Israelites had forgotten, that God is always there, that God doesn't need to wait for us to act first for God to act for good. God doesn't wait for us to get our lives together before extending God's grace and forgiveness to us. That's just not how God works. And that's why Paul can draw a straight line from suffering to hope. He can draw that straight line precisely because God is always with us. God is the water in the wilderness. Thus, Paul draws a straight line from suffering to endurance, from endurance to character, and then from character to hope. All because God is always with us. All because God doesn't wait for us to get our lives together before moving in them with grace to redeem and to reconcile and to make us over in God's own image. And that brings us to redemption. Years ago, a friend of mine was about to get married, and what she thought was her perfect childhood toppled down like a house of cards. Her parents had divorced recently, and not very long after that, her father died in the hotel room of someone nobody in the family had ever met. Everything she thought she knew appeared to have been unmasked as a lie. So she went to see her childhood pastor, and she poured her heart out to him about the mess that she had found her family's life to be. She lamented about how the fairy tale wedding that she had dreamed of all her life would not come to pass. The one person she wanted to walk her down the aisle was gone. But at a much deeper level, she missed terribly the image of what she thought her family's life had been, and wanted more than anything not to have to replace it with the reality of what it had become. The truth was, she was planning her wedding, and instead it was a funeral that she would be going to, and it bothered her. She poured her heart out about all the ways that the romance and beauty of marriage had crumbled under the weight of all that she had learned. And when she had said all of these things, her friend who had been walking with her around his yard said to her, "Come over here." And they walked over beside a flower bed, a rose garden by the side of his house, and he gestured at the ground with his cane. "What is that?" he asked. The smell was unmistakable. She knew exactly what it was. "Fertilizer," she said. "That's one word for it," the old preacher countered. And in the mystery of God's grace, biology is going to turn it into something useful. But don't you ever forget what it started out as. That is indeed the mystery of God's grace, that God can turn what is into what may yet be. That's why in this season we pause to be honest with ourselves and with God. And Paul's words this morning are indeed for us the heart of the gospel, that God is already working for the redemption that we need. The water that we need so desperately to sustain us, the living water that Jesus talks about, is always there, just under the surface, waiting in the grace of God to spring forth and to water our lives. Because you see, at the end of the day, this Lenten journey is never about whether we were faithful to God or not. God is bigger than that. You know that, don't you? You know that God sure can use us for good, but that God is more powerful than all of our motives, our experiences, our needs. God is more powerful even than our sin. No, the hope of this season, the hope of all of our seasons, does not lie in the fact that we are always faithful to God, because we aren't. Simply put, we aren't always faithful to God. You know it, and I know it, and so we confess. No, the heart of the gospel is not that we are always faithful to God. No. Our hope comes from a different source. Our hope springs from the reality that God is always faithful to us.